Who decides whether you exist or not? That question, philosophical as it may sound, was once answered not in a courtroom, not in Congress, and not in a marketplace, but in a single room inside a mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. Beechwood Mansion did not scream for attention. It didn't glitter like its neighbors, nor did it boast golden gates or ostentatious towers. It was classical, creamy, unassuming. Yet within its walls, American destinies were quietly rewritten, reputations sealed or severed, and an empire of velvet rules governed who belonged and who did not. This was not merely a home. This was a throne, and seated upon it, with a gaze as cold as the marble floors beneath her, was the one they dared to call only Mrs. Astor. No first name necessary. She needed none. She was society. Before we step further into the secrets of Beechwood and the woman who controlled an empire with nothing but invitations and silence, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history's hidden corners. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this mysterious title already has your curiosity piqued, share this video with someone who'd want to understand why Beechwood mattered and why being the 401st person could ruin your life. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor was no ordinary woman, born into a Dutch family that predated even the American Revolution. She saw herself not as a socialite, but as the living embodiment of a civilization. Her ancestors had owned swaths of Manhattan when livestock still wandered through what would become Wall Street. The Schermerhorns, or Knickerbockers, as they were dubbed, were the original aristocrats of New York. And Caroline grew up with the unshakable belief that blood, not banknotes, defined a person's worth. To her, the idea that one might earn their way into society was laughable. Ancestry was destiny. In 1853, she made a decision that would shift the axis of American society. She married William Backhouse Astor, Jr., heir to the vast Astor fortune. It was not a marriage of passion, nor of poetry, but of power. The Astors had immense wealth, fur trade, real estate, more zeros than most could count, but lacked the refinement of Caroline's genteel bloodline. The Schermerhorns, conversely, had name and pedigree but fading capital. The union was less a romance than a merger. Together, they became an unstoppable force. Caroline with her vision of a world preserved in marble and manners, William with the financial means to construct it. But even as Caroline began fashioning her court, a storm gathered on the horizon. The Civil War ended in 1865, and with peace came progress. The industrial age erupted like a geyser of molten steel and ambition. Names like Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Carnegie emerged, men who had not inherited, but built. Railroads, steel mills, oil empires. Their money was fresh, their rise meteoric, and their appetites immense. To Caroline, these men were not merely uncouth, they were dangerous. They dined too fast, adorned themselves with diamonds, and worst of all, imagined that money alone granted them status. But status, in her mind, was sacred. It could not be bought. It could only be inherited. Faced with a tidal wave of nouveau riche, climbing the marble steps of newly built palaces, Caroline crafted a defense more impenetrable than any wall. She understood that she could not stop these industrialists from building. She could not strip them of their wealth, but she could rob them of legitimacy. She could deny them recognition, and recognition was the oxygen of ambition. What use was a gilded mansion if the doors of Beechwood remained closed? to implement her strategy. Caroline enlisted a cunning co-conspirator, Samuel Ward McAllister, a Southern gentleman whose obsession with pedigree rivaled her own. Though he lacked the Astor's fortune, he possessed encyclopedic knowledge of bloodlines, gossip, and etiquette. Where Caroline was regal and static, McAllister was fluid, strategic. Together, they formed an alliance that redefined American aristocracy, not by wealth, but by access. Their plan was both simple and savage. They would curate society itself, reduce it to an elite core of precisely 400 names, and then they would decide who made the cut. In 1881, Caroline bought Beechwood, a mansion in Newport previously owned by Daniel Parrish. Unlike the other Gilded Age estates rising nearby, marble palaces and gaudy extravaganzas, Beechwood had age. It had restraint. Its Italianate facade and classical lines whispered dignity. For Caroline, that mattered. She didn't want flash. She wanted history. Yet the house, though dignified, required transformation. It had to become a fortress, a stage, a judgment hall. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, America's first formally trained architect and the designer of the breakers and marble house, to oversee the renovation. Hunt knew that he wasn't simply rebuilding a mansion. He was shaping a throne room. The centerpiece of the redesign would be a grand ballroom. But not just any ballroom. It had to be precise. McAllister calculated how many people, standing shoulder to shoulder in dresses and tuxedos, could comfortably fit within its walls. The number was 400. That number would become legend. It wasn't just architectural, it was mythological. McAllister later declared, "There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society." And just like that, society was no longer an abstract notion. It was a club with a gate, and Caroline held the key. With Beechwood as her arena, Caroline set the stage for a cultural war, the old world against the new. Entering her home was no longer about courtesy. It was ascension, and the consequences of exclusion were severe. A missing name on the invitation list could doom a social career before it began. She turned hospitality into high-stakes diplomacy. Etiquette became weaponized. Seating charts were battlefield maps. Floral arrangements spoke in coded language. Every ball was a referendum on relevance. But behind this dazzling machinery of power, a strange loneliness brewed. Her husband, William Astor Jr., detested Beechwood. He called its social charade unbearable and fled to his yacht, the Ambassadress, whenever he could, preferring the open sea and simpler company. Caroline, for all her control, reigned alone. Her world was one of gloved hands and veiled threats, a queen without a consort. And yet, the more she was left alone, the more she doubled down. The fortress walls rose higher. The rules grew stricter. Beechwood ceased to be a home and became a filter, its halls echoing with the footsteps of the worthy, its mirrors reflecting not just vanity but anxiety. Who would be invited? Who would be left behind? It was not enough to be rich. One had to be correct. Correct lineage, correct manners, correct friends. And if you were the 401st person on the list, no wealth could save you. Caroline didn't just preserve an old order. She invented a new one. She translated ancient privilege into a modern performance, and it worked for a time. But all fortresses, even those built on etiquette, eventually show cracks. And in the coming years, one woman would strike where Caroline was most vulnerable, not in her fortune, but in her family. To understand the mechanics of Carolyn Astor's dominance, one must walk the halls of Beechwood not as a guest, but as a supplicant. Because that is what it meant to be invited, to be deemed worthy by an invisible court where every gesture was a test, every detail deliberate, every silence thunderous. The transformation of Beechwood into the high church of American society was not simply an act of design, it was an act of strategy, a carefully choreographed performance in which architecture became doctrine and social rituals were sacraments. Richard Morris Hunt, the architectural genius behind some of America's most opulent homes, did not simply expand the mansion. He redefined it. He added a new ballroom wing, designed not just for dancing, but for judgment. The space had to accommodate exactly 400 guests, the number McAllister had branded as the sacred limit of real society. Not 401, not 399, 400. The walls of the room were paneled in white and trimmed with heavy gold stucco. Enormous mirrors faced one another across the ballroom, creating an endless reflection that made the space seem crowded even when it was empty, a haunting metaphor for the illusion of inclusion. The lighting was merciless. Crystal chandeliers cast sharp electric light over the polished parquet floors, leaving no corner in shadow, no place to hide. The effect was intentional. Caroline believed that darkness concealed imperfection. Light revealed everything. The mirrors did not just reflect, they multiplied. They forced each guest to see themselves as others might see them, judged, admired, envied, or erased. Every surface was a lens, every corridor a runway. No detail was spared. The air inside Beechwood was perfumed with hothouse roses shipped in daily and the pungent scent of beeswax, used to polish the floors until they gleamed like mirrors themselves. The staff, dozens of silent men and women in Astor blue livery, moved with supernatural precision. They were not servants in the traditional sense. They were the clockwork of Caroline's grand mechanism, ensuring no glass was ever half empty, no cushion out of place, no moment unscripted. They were invisible and omnipresent, like the rules of society itself. But nowhere was the symbolism more potent than in the procession of arrival. Caroline did not greet her guests at the door. That would have suggested equality. Instead, she waited in the reception hall beneath a colossal portrait of herself by the French painter Carolus Duran. This painting was not merely decoration, it was declaration. It loomed above the room, casting its cold gaze on every guest. As you entered Beechwood, you had to walk its long hallways, under chandeliers and past servants and mirrors and eyes, until at last you stood before the living Mrs. Astor, while her painted likeness watched from above. It was a double judgment, and it was meant to unnerve. And then came the ultimate test, the dance. Not just any dance, but a choreography of placement, protocol, and presentation. Daughters of old families, sons of industrial titans, European dukes and American heiresses, all were positioned as if on a chessboard, their social value marked by where they stood, who they danced with, and when they were introduced. The wrong pairing could suggest a fall from grace. The right one could change a family's fortune. These balls were not entertainments. They were rituals of affirmation. If Caroline summoned you to dance, it meant more than an invitation. It was a coronation. But this social machinery, polished as it was, exacted a cost. While the chandeliers glittered and the orchestra played, behind the scenes lay discontent. William Astor Jr., the man whose fortune funded Beechwood, found himself suffocated. He once described the house as a theatrical prison, He hated the rigid order, the stifling rules, the need to play the role of patriarch when he felt more like a prop. He preferred his yacht and the company of women who required no calling cards. Eventually, he fled Beechwood entirely, leaving Caroline to preside over her empire alone. Yet Caroline seemed undisturbed by his absence. Her devotion to etiquette bordered on fanaticism. Her decisions were final. Her pronouncements could exile a family for a generation. She was not merely feared, she was revered, and her word carried the weight of law. At her table, silence was more dangerous than scandal, and a misplaced fork could mean the death of a debutante's season. People studied her movements like scholars poring over scripture. If she turned her cheek slightly at your entrance, it could mean doom. If she offered her hand, salvation. Visitors to Beechwood often left with stories of splendor, but also of unease. One German count compared the experience to standing trial. A Boston socialite described the ballroom as an echo chamber of judgment. Yet all still came, because to be absent from Beechwood was worse than to be uncomfortable within it. To not be seen was to cease to exist. As the Gilded Age matured, the line between aristocracy and theater blurred. Society became performance, and Caroline Astor was its playwright. What's remarkable is how this strategy worked. By limiting access, she increased demand. The exclusivity of the 400 became a national obsession. Newspapers speculated on who was in and who was out. Families adjusted their behavior, their alliances, their wardrobes to meet Caroline's invisible expectations. And always, the question loomed: who would be the 401st? Of course, the number was arbitrary. There was nothing mathematical about society. But Caroline understood what luxury brands know today. Scarcity sells. Prestige isn't about money. It's about not being available to everyone. And in her ballroom, access was everything. But even as she perfected her social machinery, a kind of spiritual erosion had begun. Caroline, for all her grandeur, was increasingly isolated. Her world was shrinking, not expanding. The very rituals she invented began to consume her. She had built a temple, but it had become her prison. She had created rules so rigid that eventually even she would be forced to break them. Because just beyond the gates of Beechwood, a different kind of power was rising. The new elite, aggressive, bold, and uncaring of the old rules, were about to challenge everything. And soon, one woman among them would do the unthinkable: force Caroline Astor to kneel. For decades, Caroline Astor ruled unchallenged, her authority so absolute that few even imagined defying it. But history rarely collapses with a roar. More often, it fractures quietly, along emotional fault lines no fortress can fully protect. For Caroline, that fracture came not from a rival patriarch, not from an industrial titan, but from another woman, Alva Vanderbilt, who understood that power, once codified, could also be strategically exploited. Alva Vanderbilt was everything Caroline despised and feared. She was new money, unapologetically so. Married to William Kissam Vanderbilt, whose fortune dwarfed even the Astors. But unlike many newly wealthy families who begged for acceptance, Alva demanded it. She studied Caroline's rules not to obey them, but to weaponize them. If Caroline had turned etiquette into law, Alva intended to use that law against its creator. The battlefield was not Beechwood, but New York, and the weapon was a ball. In 1883, Alva planned the most extravagant costume ball America had ever seen. It was designed to eclipse every social event that had come before it. a direct challenge to Caroline's authority. The guest list was exhaustive. European aristocrats, American industrial heirs, cultural elites, everyone who mattered would be there. Everyone, that is, except the Astors. When invitations were delivered, Caroline discovered that her daughter Carrie had been deliberately excluded. The reason Alva gave was devastatingly precise. Mrs. Vanderbilt explained that she could not invite Carrie because Caroline herself had never called on her, nor left a calling card. It was not an insult. It was protocol. Caroline's own rules, perfectly observed, now barred her child from society's most glittering stage. For the first time in her life, Caroline Astor was cornered. This was no longer a philosophical battle about old money versus new. This was maternal. Carrie Astor, young and eager, had prepared for the ball with all the hope and anxiety of a debutante who knew that visibility meant future. To be absent was to be invisible. Caroline could preserve her principles and crush her daughter, or she could bend and survive. The choice tormented her. For years, Caroline had taught society that rules mattered more than feelings, that order outweighed emotion. But now, the abstract gave way to the personal, and in that moment, the Queen chose her child. Quietly, without ceremony. Caroline's carriage rolled to the Vanderbilt residence. A small piece of cardboard, a calling card, was left at the door. That single gesture detonated decades of carefully maintained hierarchy. Word spread instantly. Society gasped. The unthinkable had happened. Caroline Astor had blinked. She attended the Vanderbilt ball, her presence signaling not just acceptance, but surrender. Alva had won, not through rebellion, but through perfect compliance. The old order did not fall in flames. It dissolved in etiquette. Though Caroline continued to host at Beechwood, something essential had been lost. The illusion of invincibility was gone. If Mrs. Astor could be compelled, then her rules were negotiable. The gates were no longer absolute. The 400 became elastic. The new elite poured in, reshaping society from within. Caroline remained its figurehead, but her authority was ceremonial now, not sovereign. As the years passed, her health declined. The social world she had tried so desperately to freeze in time continued to move forward without her permission. In 1908, Caroline Astor died, and with her passed an era. Beechwood, once electrified by her presence, fell into silence. The ballroom that had decided reputations echoed only with memory. The house passed to her son, John Jacob Astor IV, and in him, the Astor legacy underwent a profound transformation. John Jacob was the antithesis of his mother. Where Caroline looked backward, he looked ahead. He was fascinated by invention, filing patents for bicycle brakes and road paving machines. He wrote speculative fiction about life on other planets. He was curious, restless, and increasingly impatient with the suffocating codes of old society. Beechwood ceased to be a fortress of exclusion and became simply a home, albeit a grand one. His personal life shocked society even more than his ideas. At 50, he divorced and married Madeline Force, an 18-year-old woman whose youth symbolized everything Carolyn would have rejected. The marriage scandalized New York. Newspapers devoured it. Social arbiters clutched their pearls. But John Jacob did not retreat. He did not seek approval. He had inherited his mother's fortune, but not her fear. To escape scrutiny, the couple traveled abroad, moving through Europe and Egypt, far from the gossip of Newport and Manhattan. Beechwood waited for their return, renovated and ready for a new chapter. But history, indifferent to preparation, had other plans. The crisis that would define the Astor legacy forever was already underway. Far from ballrooms and calling cards, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. When John Jacob Astor IV slipped beneath the freezing waves of the Atlantic, he took more than his life and legacy with him. He took the soul of an era. Beechwood, once the shimmering epicenter of American aristocracy, became a hollow shell, its opulence frozen in time, its chandeliers collecting dust instead of applause. The social machine that Carolyn Astor had engineered with ruthless precision sputtered to a halt. Her air was gone, her ballroom silenced, her ideology washed away in the brine of tragedy. For a time, Beechwood remained in the hands of Jack's young widow, Madeline. She lived there with her son, John Jacob Astor VI, nicknamed Jakey, who would grow up in the shadow of both unimaginable wealth and a gaping absence. But the house, for all its grandeur, could no longer serve its original function. The world had changed too quickly. The war that followed the Titanic's sinking tore apart the last remnants of Gilded Age civility. After World War I, no one wanted to dance beneath portraits of dead kings or sip champagne beside men in monocles. Society was no longer obsessed with the 400. It was obsessed with the modern, the fast, the free. The fall of Beechwood mirrored the fall of an entire class. Other great Newport mansions fell too. Some were demolished, others sold off. Still others turned into museums filled with velvet ropes and dusty tour guides. A few were preserved by historical societies, who desperately tried to maintain the illusion of a golden age that, in truth, had never been quite so golden for anyone outside the ballroom. Beechwood suffered indignities its builders could never have imagined. Once the stage for the most exclusive parties in America, it became a theater. Literally, in the mid-20th century, actors performed historical reenactments in its drawing rooms, pretending to be Astors and Vanderbilts, greeting guests as if the Gilded Age had never ended. To those who understood the house's past, it was a desecration. To others, it was simply the price of survival. History, like legacy, must be paid for, and Beechwood, stripped of its power, had to earn its keep. Then, in 2010, something astonishing happened. The house was put up for sale, again. But this time, the buyer was not a socialite or a politician. It was a man who represented the very force that Carolyn Astor had spent her life resisting: the rise of new money. Larry Ellison, co-founder of Oracle Corporation and one of the wealthiest individuals in the world, purchased Beechwood for $10.5 million. The man who had made his billions not in land or fur or steel, but in code, invisible algorithms, now owned the most visible symbol of old-world power. The irony was impossible to ignore. Ellison, whose wealth came from the very technology that had dissolved the barriers of class and rank, became the custodian of the fortress built to keep people like him out. And yet, unlike many before him, he did not gut the mansion or rebuild it into a hyper-modern estate. He restored it, with precision, with reverence, with an almost fanatical attention to detail. He poured over $100 million into its resurrection, not to live in it, but to house his personal collection of 18th and 19th century art. In doing so, Ellison did something remarkable. He bridged two eras. He preserved the aesthetic of the past using the resources of the future. The software king gave new breath to a temple of vanished power. Caroline Astor would likely have fainted at the idea that her sanctum now belonged to a man who had never danced the quadrille, who had never left a calling card, who had never once consulted Burke's peerage. But the truth was undeniable. The fortress survived because the outsider valued it more than her heirs did. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Beechwood. That legacy, once weaponized as exclusion, can transform into preservation. The house stands not because it was better than the others, but because it was loved by a man who had no need to impress anyone, and who owed his place in history to nothing but his own vision. Beechwood's walls now echo not with violins, but with quiet footsteps of docents, the murmur of guests, the hum of climate control systems preserving oil paintings and French furniture. But the deeper resonance of Beechwood lies beyond architecture. It is a mirror not of wealth, but of our own anxieties. Caroline Astor's 400 was not just a guest list. It was a symbol of fear. The fear of being left out. The fear of being the 401st. Today, we no longer wait for ball invitations, but for likes, for followers, for verification badges. The currency has changed, but the psychology remains. We are still, in our own way, queuing outside locked doors, hoping to be let in. The machinery of social exclusion is subtler now, but it is no less ruthless. Private groups, curated feeds, algorithms deciding whose face is seen. We pretend to be freer, but we are still dancing in ballrooms of judgment, and every generation builds its own Beechwood, whether in steel and stone or in code and clout. But time is the great leveler. The ocean that batters the cliffs below Beechwood has no memory of Caroline Astor, or John Jacob, or Madeline, or Larry Ellison. It crashes, eternal and indifferent, against the rocks. And that sound, the same one Caroline heard when she first claimed this shore, remains unchanged. The ocean does not care if you are the queen of society or a stoker on a ship. It welcomes all equally. It erases all footprints eventually. Beechwood endures, not because of wealth, but because of story. It is a cautionary tale dressed in brocade. It is a temple and a tomb, a triumph and a tragedy. Its beauty was once a barrier. Now, it is a bridge. And those who walk through its grand mirrored halls do not just see reflections of chandeliers. They see themselves, their longing, their fear, their ambition. Caroline Astor tried to make dignity a possession, like a dress or a name. But real dignity cannot be owned. It is shown in how we live, in how we treat others, in how we face the end. And if her son Jack taught us anything, it is that grace in death speaks louder than power in life. We are all renters in history. The walls remain longer than the whispers. But if we listen, really listen, we might still hear the ghost of a waltz, a mother's decision, a lifeboat splashing, a door unlocking, or just the ocean, eternal, unmoved, free.